Hi everyone, today let's listen to the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It was in the middle of winter when snowflakes fluttered like birds across the sky. There was a queen sitting sewing by the window. The window frame was made of black ebony wood. As the queen sewed, she was distracted by watching the snow fall, and she pricked her finger with the needle, causing 3 drops of blood to fall onto the pristine white snow. Seeing the vibrant red against the snow, the queen said to herself, "If only I had a child with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as the ebony wood of this window frame, it would be wonderful." Not long after, she gave birth to a daughter with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony wood. She named the girl Snow White. However, shortly after the child was born, the queen passed away. After a year of mourning, the king remarried. The new queen was beautiful but proud and arrogant. She would become furious at the mere suggestion that someone might be more beautiful than her. This queen had a magic mirror, and whenever she stood before it, she would ask, "Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" The mirror would reply, "My queen, you are fairest here, it's true, but Snow White is even fairer than you." The queen was greatly pleased, as she knew the mirror spoke the truth. Snow White grew more beautiful as she grew older. By the time Snow White was 7, she was as beautiful as the morning sun, even more so than the queen herself. Once, the queen sat before the mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" The mirror answered, "Fair queen, you're lovely, it's true, but Snow White is lovelier than you." The queen was shocked to hear this, and her face turned green with envy. From then on, every time she saw Snow White, she felt uneasy, resentful, and eventually grew to hate the girl. The queen's jealousy and bitterness towards Snow White intensified day by day, tormenting her constantly. She called a huntsman and instructed him, "Take this child into the deep forest. I never want to see her face again. Hide her away deep in the woods for me." The huntsman obeyed and led the girl into the deep forest. As they entered the forest, Snow White cried out, "Oh, kind huntsman, spare me. I will flee into the wild forest, and I promise I will never return to the castle again." Seeing the beautiful girl, the huntsman felt pity and said, "You may hide in the forest. It's too cruel to harm you." The huntsman thought, perhaps a wild beast will devour her instead. But despite his thoughts, he felt relieved for not causing harm to the girl. Just then, a wild boar approached, and the huntsman caught it, taking its heart and liver back to the queen as evidence. The wicked queen, believing it to be Snow White's heart and liver, ordered the palace cook to prepare them for her to eat. Convinced that it was Snow White's organs, she ate them eagerly. Meanwhile, poor Snow White wandered alone in the vast forest, fearful and confused, not knowing what to do. She ran blindly, trampling over thorns and sharp rocks. Wild beasts circled her, but none dared to harm her. She continued running until dusk, when she finally saw a small cottage and sought refuge inside. Inside the cottage, everything was tiny, cute, and impeccably clean. There was a small table covered with a pristine white cloth, on which were 7 tiny plates, each with a spoon, knife, fork, and beside them was a small, dainty cup. Along the walls were 7 small beds in a row, each with a white snow-like cover. Hungry and thirsty, Snow White ate a little from each plate, a bit of bread and vegetables, and drank a sip of wine from each cup, not wanting anyone to miss their share. After spending the day fleeing through the forest, she was exhausted and wanted to lay herself down to rest, but none of the beds seemed right. Some were too long, some too short. Only the 7th bed seemed just right, so Snow White laid down and fell asleep. As darkness fell, the owners of the little cottage returned, 7 dwarfs who spent their days mining for iron in the mountains. They lit 7 little lamps, and as the light spread throughout the cottage, they felt as though someone had been inside, as things were not exactly as they left them. The first dwarf said, "Who's been sitting in my chair?" The second said, "Who's been eating from my plate?" The third said, "Who's been eating my bread?" The fourth said, "Who's been tasting my vegetables?" The fifth said, "Who's been using my fork?" The sixth said, "Who's been cutting with my knife?" And the seventh said, "Who's been drinking from my cup?" When they reached the seventh bed, they found Snow White lying there, asleep. They were amazed at the sight of such a beautiful girl and exclaimed in unison, "Oh, what a lovely child!" The dwarfs looked at each other in surprise, marveling at her beauty. Then, one brave dwarf approached her and gently lifted her from the bed, waking her. Snow White opened her eyes and saw the 7 dwarfs surrounding her. She was afraid at first, but the dwarfs spoke softly, reassuring her that she was safe. They listened to her story and felt sorry for her, deciding to let her stay with them in the cottage. Snow White lived happily with the 7 dwarfs, taking care of their home while they were away, cleaning, cooking, and tending to the garden. In return, the dwarfs treated her with kindness and affection, and they grew to love her dearly. Meanwhile, the wicked queen, believing Snow White to be dead, continued to ask her mirror, "Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" The mirror replied, "My queen, you're lovely, it's true, but Snow White, beyond the mountains with the 7 dwarfs, is still 1,000 times lovelier than you." The queen was furious and decided to take matters into her own hands. She resolved to kill Snow White herself, using her dark magic to disguise herself as an old peddler woman selling laces and ribbons. One day, when the dwarfs were away, the queen, disguised as the peddler woman, approached the cottage where Snow White lived. She knocked on the door, calling out, "Laces and ribbons for sale! Lovely laces and colorful ribbons for the fairest maiden in all the land." Snow White, hearing the voice, looked out the window and saw the old woman holding a basket of laces and ribbons. She opened the door and greeted the woman kindly. "Good day, dear maiden," said the queen in her sweetest voice. "Would you like to see my laces and ribbons? They are the finest in the land." Snow White was delighted by the beautiful laces and ribbons and invited the old woman inside. As she examined the laces, the queen saw her chance. She pulled out a lace, made of the finest silk, and with a sudden movement, she wrapped it around Snow White's neck, pulling it tight. Snow White struggled, but the lace was too strong. She fell to the ground, unconscious. The queen, thinking Snow White was dead, laughed triumphantly and hurried away, leaving the cottage before the dwarfs returned. When the dwarfs returned home, they found Snow White lying on the ground, still and pale, with the lace wrapped around her neck. They feared the worst and wept bitterly, mourning the loss of their beloved friend. The queen laughed triumphantly and hurried away, leaving Snow White lying on the ground, still and pale. When the dwarfs returned home and found Snow White lying on the ground, they were heartbroken. They wept bitterly, believing that their beloved friend was dead. However, one dwarf noticed something peculiar about Snow White's appearance. He carefully examined her and found a small red mark on her lips, as if she had been poisoned. With a sense of urgency, he searched for any sign of life and felt a faint heartbeat. Realizing that Snow White was still alive, the dwarfs rejoiced and quickly set to work trying to revive her. They tried everything they could think of, but nothing seemed to work. Finally, one dwarf remembered a legend he had heard long ago about a prince who had been awakened from a deep sleep by the kiss of true love. With a sense of hope, the dwarfs decided to carry Snow White to a nearby meadow where she would be safe until the prince arrived. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, but still, Snow White lay in her enchanted sleep. The dwarfs watched over her night and day, never losing hope that one day, she would awaken. One day, as the sun was setting and the birds were singing their evening song, a handsome prince rode through the forest on his noble steed. He was drawn to the meadow by the sound of sweet music and the sight of 7 dwarfs gathered around a sleeping maiden. As the prince approached, the dwarfs explained to him the story of Snow White, the beautiful maiden who had been poisoned by the wicked queen. The prince was filled with compassion for Snow White and determined to awaken her from her enchanted sleep. He bent down and kissed her gently on the lips, and at that moment, Snow White's eyes fluttered open. She looked up at the prince, her heart filled with love and gratitude, and knew that he was her true love. The prince helped Snow White to her feet, and together, they walked hand in hand through the forest, leaving behind the cottage and the 7 dwarfs. They journeyed to the prince's kingdom, where they were married in a grand ceremony attended by all the nobles and villagers. Snow White and her prince lived happily ever after, ruling the kingdom with wisdom and compassion. And though the wicked queen was never seen again, her memory lived on in the hearts of those who had known her cruelty, a reminder of the power of love to conquer even the darkest magic. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more.